Hey guys, Ben from bachphotography here, and today we are looking at a portrait session I did with Amy Caldwell, a local model to my area. I'll leave a link in the description to more of her work if you're interested in checking that out. And today this video is going to be about shooting portraits with a Sigma 85mm 1.4, or really any 85mm lens, and also the Godox AD600 BM studio strobe. And this video will also apply to any studio strobe that you might have in case you're interested in learning about lighting techniques and taking portraits with studio strobes. So today I used a Sony a7R II, a Sigma 85mm 1.4 art lens, and the Sigma MC11 adapter so that I could use my Canon version 85mm on my Sony camera. And I was using the Godox AD600 BM studio strobe, which is the manual version of the strobe, and then also a cheap $20 stand just to keep that up as well. And I'd just like to say as well, I wouldn't recommend using a super cheap tacky stand if you're going to use a studio strobe like this, just because you could see the flex in the stand from the weight of the strobe, and it was kind of freaky watching it sort of bend and twist in the wind, and actually the strobe did fall over at one point as well, so that's something to keep in mind if you're going to use one of these big heavy strobes. So let's talk a little bit about lighting. I used 1/32 power on this scene because the sunlight was extremely bright in the background, and I wanted to keep a lot of the ambient light in the scene as well as having some light shine straight onto my subject. So if I shot my studio strobe at full power, for example, and then changed my camera settings to adjust so that using that full power would still create perfect exposure on my subject, that would mean that the ambient light would be sort of drowned out because you're using settings on your camera that compensate for this super bright and powerful strobe that you're using. So the more powerful that you make your strobe and then adjust your camera settings to compensate for that, the darker the background is going to be, because your strobe is so much brighter than the ambient light. Your camera has to adjust for that super bright light instead of for the ambient light. So basically, if you want to have really nice, warm, happy portraits, you have to make your studio strobe just a little bit brighter than the ambient light, because that means that when you're taking your photos you have a perfect exposure on your subject from your strobe, but then because the ambient light is quite similar in power to your strobe, you're still getting a really nice brightness in the background. Conversely, if you want to add some drama to your image and make the background a bit darker and then really pull focus your subject, what you want to do is you want to make your lighting on your subject much brighter than the ambient light, and what that will do is when your camera adjusts for perfect exposure of your really powerful bright studio light, it'll make all the ambient light in comparison super dark and really pull focus to your subject. So here's the photo that we're going to be looking at in detail this time in this video, and the reason I chose this photo is because I was going out of my comfort zone a little bit taking this image, because one of my problems with portrait photography, and I think it's important that you should always self-reflect and try to fix your problems when it comes to photography, is that I always shoot portraits where the models are looking straight into the camera, and I think that I'm really missing out on doing a lot of fantastic portraits where the model is either looking away or has their eyes closed, and other situations where they're not looking straight at the camera. So that's why we're choosing this image today. The camera settings for this were a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, an aperture of f1.4, and an ISO of 200. So the reason I chose a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second is because I wanted a nice fast shutter speed so that there was no camera shake blurring the image, and if you're shooting portraits on an 85mm, you really want to have your shutter speed at least about 1/200th of a second. So because I've got quite shaky hands, I decided to go a little bit higher than that and go all the way to 1/500th of a second. The reason I shot a aperture of f1.4 is because I really wanted to blur out the background and make Amy really pull all the focus to the image and not leave any distractions in the background. And as you can see, there are quite a lot of trees in the background that if we shot at a higher aperture, they might be a bit of a distraction. So shooting super wide open at 1.4 really blew out all of those distractions and left the viewer of the image focusing directly on Amy. And the reason I chose an ISO of 200 is because this perfected my exposure triangle of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, which meant that I had a perfect exposure at ISO 200. If I'd gone down to ISO 100, I probably still would have had a reasonable exposure, And for most people, shooting at a slightly slower shutter speed than I did, and then shooting at the native ISO of your camera, that probably would have produced a very slightly better image in terms of the detail inside the picture. But because my hands are a little bit shaky, and I don't think I would have got a crisp image at 1/200th of a second, I decided to shoot a little bit faster and then bump up my ISO just a little bit, sacrificing just a little bit of signal fidelity to my sensor, but making sure that I get nice, crisp, sharp images out of camera. So here's a quick lighting diagram of the scene. Let's jump into Camera Raw and native Photoshop as well and do the editing process on this image. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is add a little bit of clarity to the entire image, and then the next thing I do is I adjust the exposure just so that the face or general skin tone is about the right exposure, and I think this is about right, so just adding a little bit more exposure, and I think that's perfect. So the background is looking a little bit washed out, and so is the browns in the foreground here as well, just because I was shooting in RAW, so you get a bit more of a washed out look, just so you can add your own flair to it afterwards, unlike JPEG, which already has sort of a robust color. So I'm just going to add some overall vibrance to the entire image, and the reason I use vibrance over saturation is, this is the reason I'll show you. Basically with vibrance you're adding more of the colors that are pastel than the really strong colors. So if I add a little bit of vibrance, you can see that it's a much more aesthetically pleasing color than if I add a little bit of saturation. As you can see, the greens here, they're looking pretty hectic, but if I use vibrance instead, they're not getting quite as strong. So that's the reason I use vibrance instead of saturation. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop that entire highlights as well. Not too much, otherwise the skin on Emmy's face starts to get a little bit strange. So I'm just going to drop it a little bit, maybe 13 points. I reckon that looks pretty good. And then boost the shadows up a little bit, and also the blacks, and then also add some contrast as well. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So the next step I'm going to do is just get the paintbrush tool, zoom in onto Amy's skin. And by the way, if you can hear me burping away, I'm just a little bit sick at the moment, so I apologize for that. Just going to drop the exposure and the blacks and then fill in all her skin. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm using the brush tool as a selection tool, and by dropping the exposure and the blacks all the way down, basically what I can do here is I can see exactly where I'm selecting. And once I've finished doing all this selection of her skin, I'm going to smooth all her skin at once using the clarity tool. Basically I'm just going to reduce some of the clarity on her skin, and that basically smooths it out overall. I'm just going to do her feet as well. Don't need to be too careful with this because her feet are slightly blurry because I aimed focus for her face. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to reset my brush. Then I'll zoom in as well so you can see the difference that it makes once I reduce the clarity. So at the moment, okay, we're on 0%. If I boost that all the way, you get some really impressive detail in her face, but obviously we don't want that. We want our skin to look really nice and smooth, so we're just going to drop that about 30 points. So that's before and after. And as you can see, it really smooths out the skin quite nicely. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do, reset the brush tool and then just add a little bit of clarity and a little bit of exposure, and just going to make her eyes pop a little bit more. And when you're zoomed in, you can't really see a big difference to what that does, but it actually makes a huge difference once you've zoomed out. I'm just going to drop the shadows as well, just to make her eyelashes and the shadows of her eyelids a little bit more pronounced. Reset my brush tool again, get rid of the exposure and clarity change, and then just with shadows, add a little bit more shadow into her eyebrows. Yeah, her eyebrows, that's right. Yep, cool. Alright, that's looking pretty sweet. So next step, just reset the brush tool again, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the right click to make my brush much bigger, about this size, and then I'm going to add in some fake sunlight. So we ended up shooting this particular portrait, I think it was about 10 in the morning, and it goes bright about 6 AM at the moment where I live. So it was just a little bit too late to get that beautiful golden light. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to add a little bit in. And then also, because we were quite close to her hair, which is a really dark area of her body, we're just going to add a little bit of darkness back in, just because when I boosted the exposure around that area, it just made it a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to reset my brush there and drop the exposures and the shadows slightly. And that should be enough just to add some of that darkness back in. And all these changes are very subtle. We don't want to make any crazy changes and make anything look like it's not meant to be there. So that looks pretty good. I think that's everything camera raw. Let's jump into native Photoshop and add the final touches and finish the image off. Okay, so what's the first thing I noticed? Well, the first thing I always like to do is just zoom into the face, and then we've got two tools we're going to use here. First of all, we're going to use the spot healing brush tool, and that will be just below the eyedropper tool. Basically, what we're going to do now is we're just going to get an appropriate size and see any of the areas that we don't like, just little blemishes, for example these two here, and just clicking on them to remove them. So the first step is we're just going to click and remove any of the big blemishes that we see. Amy's skin's pretty good actually, so we've got a pretty easy job here, just removing any of the little blemishes on her skin. And then if you seem to find any blemishes, for example, you can see that scar there is not going away when I click over it. You can hold down this tool here, then go to the patch tool, just circle the area that you don't like, and then drag it somewhere smooth, and as you can see now, that has removed that scar. So I like to use a little bit of the patch tool and a little bit of the spot healing brush, just depends on my mood really. They basically do the same thing. The patch tool is better for getting rid of stubborn blemishes, and the spot healing brush is just a quick tool to get rid of any imperfections on a model's skin. So I'm not going to do too much work here, just because we are quite zoomed in, and you won't really be able to see any of her blemishes anyway once this is put on her Instagram and on our Facebooks and things like that. So this is really more just an OCD thing for me. It's just a bit of fun to do, so I like getting her skin to look good. Okay, that looks pretty good. There's just a couple more issues here and there. And I reckon I'll stop there, just otherwise I could be here for hours. The video might get a little bit boring. So once we have finished that, we go back and, okay, what else needs to be done on this image? Well, what might be nice is just get the liquify tool and bring her back in here just slightly, because she was wearing quite a baggy top, so it makes it look like her posture is a bit bent, but I think it's just that her top was a little bit baggy. So just going to move that in a little bit there. And then also we're going to puff her hair out a little bit too, just to make it look a little bit more full and thick. Don't want to go too far with this type of haircut, otherwise it might look a bit strange. If you're liquefying someone's hair who has really long hair, you can go quite crazy with this technique and make their hair look really thick and full. But because she's got a bob cut, we need to be a little bit more careful with the liquify tool. Great, so that is before and after. I think that really makes a massive difference. And one last thing before we go is I'm just going to make a selection of Amy, like so. Then we're going to go to the select tool up here, invert, and now we have a selection of everywhere that isn't Amy. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and 1.5 pixels. And what we're doing here is we're just adding a little bit of extra blur to the background to really make Amy pop from the scene. So I'm just going to move the selection around and add a couple more. And the reason I move the selection around is because if I had the selection there the whole time, and then I added blur after blur after blur, on this line you would be able to see a very distinct stoppage of the blur, where this area here would be incredibly blurry and then this area here would be considerably less blurry. So we just move the selection around like this every so often, just so we have a more even distribution from pretty blurry here to really, really blurry here. Okay, so that's pretty much everything in this image. So thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you did enjoy this video, and I'd love to hear in the comments what you would do to make this image better. I'm always interested in hearing your thoughts, and once again, thank you very much for watching.